Okay, welcome everybody. This week's parsha is Shemoth. It's the year 5780. It's the 20th. Tonight is the 21st of Tevet, if I'm not mistaken, 16th of January. The politics are really heating up now. Just to date this video, last night we closed the party lists for the upcoming Knesset elections. Round 3 it is, and I only hope that God has mercy on our souls and mercy on his land, because we're in a real heck of a situation right now. I have nothing to say about the Parsha this week. If you look at previous videos in previous years on the Torah Box website or on my Facebook page, so enjoy those. We're going to continue talking about the calendar. We're going to pick up Zmanim and Halacha. We accept the Sabbath early. That is something that's a tactical idea. It's not agreed upon among the Rishonim, the early authorities, if it's necessarily obligatory. First, we have to draw a line. We have to say, when does the day start? If we assume that a Jewish day ends at sunset, and that's when the next day begins, so the Sabbath should start a little bit earlier than that, if that is our line. And that's the line that we tend to use. And therefore, we should take in the Sabbath sometime before that, significantly, as the Mishnah Berurah says. It could be as little as 10 minutes. Anything else is not halachically significant because it could be easily be confused. But that should be standard. In some places, 18 minutes. A very late practice in Jerusalem was to accept the Sabbath as much as 40 minutes before sunset. Assuming clear conditions and people who use sundials, this is actually something even in olden days that they could do without technology. You know how soon the Sabbath is coming. A lot of the classical poskim felt that accepting the Sabbath early is obligatory. The Vilna Gaon has a well-known comment on the Shulchan Aruch there, where he seeks to show that the Maimonidean position is that it is not obligatory, but there's still a fulfillment of a commandment. His classic mitzvah kiyumis as opposed to chiyuvis. That's what the Vilna Gaon says about a number of things that he happens to agree with Maimonides about. The other classic one, of course, is eating matzah on the last day of Passover. It's not an obligatory mitzvah. It's an elective mitzvah that one could choose to perform, and that would be a good thing. Let's see the next thing. So we take in the time for the Sabbath basically at the sunset. Technically speaking, the Sabbath is out when the stars come out, and that is as little as maybe 15 minutes, 18 minutes, sometimes 24 minutes after sunsets. And the fact is that there are very few places where people actually let out the Sabbath that early. That is because, once again, we're dealing with a strict biblical law. So it's better to be machmir. And as a public policy issue, if we would actually put on the calendars and tell them, for example, that the Sabbath would be out 20 minutes after sundown even, you can be sure that people will be letting out the Sabbath even earlier than that. And that's not so good. So as a public policy, it's a good thing to just have a rule that we only let the Sabbath out much later. I remember in New York, they let out the Sabbath sometimes 42 to 45 minutes after the sunset when it's really, really dark out, much later than they do in the land of Israel. But don't forget, the farther one is from the equator, the longer it takes for the stars to come out after sunset. There was a lot of talk about this in previous centuries, how to adjust for that, how much to compensate for it. And they basically nowadays calculate how far the sun is below the horizon in terms of degrees. The more farther one is from the equator, the lower the angle of declination of the sun. That means if you're at the equator, the sun goes down totally vertically, basically every day. And the sun continues at a certain rate across the sky. So it gets, because all of that motion is basically in your down direction below the horizon, if you're on the equator, it gets dark pretty quickly. And if you're in the land of Israel, the sun sets at about a 30-degree angle or so, a little bit slower. If you're in New York, it's even higher. So the sun goes more slow below the horizon, and you can imagine in places that get even far north, let's say Moscow and Scotland and places like that. So the sun is basically setting at an angle like this, almost less than 45 degrees to the horizon. So it takes quite a long time for it to get darker, even during the even during the winter months, when the day is very short, it still takes their twilight period is still longer. And that is why you could find different local practices about when to let the Sabbath out. And as we pointed out, this is also the standard, halachically speaking, for when one should be saying Shema in the evening, and also when ritual purity takes effect. If someone, for whatever reason, went to immerse himself in the mikveh because he was ritually impure that day, and now he wants a chance to, let's say, eat the truma. That's the example in the beginning of brachot, where we're just learning in Daf Yomi. So the kohen has to wait until his ritual purity takes effect, and then he could eat truma. And that's why he waits for the sun to go down and for the stars to come out. And as we saw, they added all sorts of other observances to this standard. They say, for example, nowadays that reading the Megillah the night of Purim, they should also do after sundown. After the stars come out. That's a little bit iffy. It seems pretty clear from the earlier sources that they never had this idea. First of all, the sages didn't even institute the reading of the Megillah at night. That's a post-Talmudic rule. And even so, it seems pretty clear that it was almost unheard of and perhaps even dangerous to tell all the people, by the way, who are fasting on Tanis Esther, to wait around until it's certainly the stars have come out just for them to continue reading, to start the reading of the Megillah. Nowadays, we're a little bit spoiled, but I'm surprised I haven't seen this in a lot of minyanim, where they would actively, let's say, read the Megillah right after sundown, or even as sundown approaches on Tanis Esther, so that the people can at least go home around the time when the stars come out. And as I have tried to point out to a number of people, this has a consequence every time there has been a public fast day. The first Beit Yosef on the first comment that the author of the Shulchan Aruch has in his longer commentary, not the bottom line rulings that he has on Shulchan Aruch, but in the Beit Yosef, when he talks about this rule about what time to let out fasts, he says something very interesting. He points out that the Talmudic standard of when a public fast day is over is sundown. That's explicit in a number of places. Yet, because they started using Rabbeinu Tam's theory, that is, when I say theory, I mean his general way of explaining all the halachic terminology that we use and that which we actually see in front of us, Rabbeinu Tam felt, as we said before, that the actual halachic sunset is sometime well after sunset, almost an hour later, let's say, here in the land of Israel, which is almost indiscernible. And it's just a few minutes, once again, that 15 minutes or so, before all the stars come out. That's Rabbeinu Tam's opinion. So because they were waiting for this halachic sundown, almost an hour after actual sundown, and because they could not discern such a thing, but they could discern or just play it safe and wait another 15 minutes or so for that time to pass and all the stars to come out, the standard became when the stars come out. That's when we let out the fast. And then, societally, we have experienced a major shift in the late 1800s towards the early 1900s and beyond, that now we went back to the system that was proposed by the Vilna Gaon, the older system, actually. And we once again use sunset as the halachic sunset, yet they still print in the calendars that the public fast days are over at the time when the stars come out, which is kind of odd because we only started using that standard because we were redefining sunset. So I'm surprised that they, at least for these minor public fast days, they don't print that, by the way, the fast day happens to be over at sunset. And that's the way it should be, definitely for Tanis Esther, which is also a post-Talmudic fast and is not one that was instituted for mourning of the temple or any other reason. It used to even be a holiday in its own right in Second Temple times. It was Nicanor Day. So I'm very surprised by that. I think it's wrong. However, Yom Kippur, because it's like a Sabbath, is also over at the time when the stars come out. That's true. And the sages also say that that is a chumrah that was kept on Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av in former times was a Jewish fast day marking the destruction of the temple. And the sages said even at the twilight of that fast day, one should continue fasting and wait certainly until the stars come out to let out Tisha B'Av. I believe that Tisha B'Av was an interesting observance. I'm very optimistic, as always, that It is a thing of the past, and that's why I only refer to it in the past tense, and I think everybody else should. And an update on the Haggadah, by the way, that brings us to something important. The Haggadot were printed this week. And if you have been one of our supporters, thank you very much. And God willing, you will be getting your Haggadah very soon. They were supposed to be bound this week. In the coming weeks, they'll be mailed out, and you'll maybe even find some in stores. It's very important that every Jewish home get a copy of the Haggadah so that the members of the family will know what to do this Passover. I told the mashgiach of a prominent yeshiva here in the land of Israel, if only the people here were to invest as much as they were in preparing for a proper Passover as they were, for example, for Tisha B'Av, then we'd already be there. I can imagine what went into, or more than, must have been 25 years ago when I first got Art Scrolls Machzer, so to speak, for Tisha B'Av. I bought this at the YU's farm sale back when I was in high school and in YU's high school. And it was the keynote in a new translation and commentary and a complete service for Tisha B'Av. And I bought this in February around my birthday. I bought this in February. They were preparing for about a year in advance for a book that they started selling in the winter, getting ready for Tisha B'Av. That way, when Tisha B'Av hits in another, 4 or 5 months, 5 months before Tisha B'Av, you should be ready for Tisha B'Av. You have a new keynote, and you'll be able to sit there. It's like getting ready to sit Shiva, which is a terrible, terrible thing. One should never prepare to do such a thing. Children aren't trained to sit Shiva because we don't do that. If only Art Scroll had put in all their effort to write the Haggadah that I did, maybe we would have gotten somewhere. But I beat them to it, and I hope that they see the light. I hope that they perhaps will take us on and decide to publish the Haggadah themselves. That would really be a good help, and maybe help me create the English version, because many of our brethren in the diaspora won't have time to become so familiar with the Hebrew in time for this coming Passover. So that would help. And if anybody wants to also support or collaborate with us producing the French version and the Spanish version and other languages that many Jews around the world speak, please contact me. We'll give you that information in the comments. Okay, back to Zmanim. We mentioned what time the Sabbaths end, Yom Tov ends, what time the fast days should end. We hope that there shouldn't be, but even in temple times they had fast days, not the fast days that you and I recognize, but emergency fast days in case there was droughts, famines, chas v'shalom, war. These are mentioned in the Bible and the Mishnah that they actually did this, even in the days of the first temple. And we have it recorded that they declared a fast day. And in the olden days, they used to sanctify the fast day. The sages point out, what does it mean? They would sanctify the fast day. It means that when they had a real public fast day, they told people you can't do work on those days. Not exactly like on a Sabbath, but people weren't supposed to be doing melacha. They were supposed to treat it like a holy day. And that's what Rambam says. When we have our public fast days, people should treat them like Yom Kippur. It's a chance to repent, and therefore one should treat it with a certain measure of holiness. And let's move on to topic number 4, which is the principles of the Luach. That's the Hebrew calendar. We have the solar cycle. You could look up in the sky. You can see that the sun, people have been doing this for millennia. They notice that the sun has a certain cycle that's based on the Earth's orbit around the sun. When the Earth is in a certain area of space, let's just say to the left side of the sun arbitrarily, then the northern hemisphere is pointing toward the sun. The Earth is spinning about its axis. The axis is about 23 degrees or so off of the plane of the rotation of the sun around the Earth. Or the Earth around the sun. And that makes it so as the Earth is spinning on its axis, which gives us the daylight and the nighttime, some parts of the world at certain times of the year get more sunlight than others. Of course, the places equatorial get the same amount of sunlight all the time, which is why they barely have some seasons. Some places do have seasons, though. The length of the days is always the same. And when the Earth has its northern hemisphere pointed toward the sun, that's basically when northern places have summer. It also means that because the pole is pointed toward the sun, at the pole it's daytime the entire time. It's daytime for six whole months of the year, and then nighttime for the other 6 months of the year. And when the pole is pointed toward the southern pole is pointed toward the sun, you get winter in the northern hemisphere and summer in the southern hemisphere. That is the solar cycle, and the moon cycle is not in any way aligned with that. The moon orbits the sun in a certain way such that it's a little bit lagging. It's a little bit slower. Every day we see the moon go around the Earth, almost make a complete rotation relative to that of the sun, except it keeps falling behind the sun. If on, let's say, Erev Rosh Chodesh, the sun and the moon are almost in the same part of the sky from our point of view, then the next day the sun will set and the moon is slightly lagging. And the next day, even more of a lag, and that's why the moon keeps getting bigger. Until the middle of the month, the moon is basically 180 degrees opposite side of the sky. When the sun is setting, the moon is rising. That's what causes a new moon. And eventually the sun starts to catch up. The moon sets, and then the sun is approaching it. And then it begins to overlap again. So if a month was exactly 30 days, 30 sunsets, the moon would set 29 of those days. Okay, and you can look at calendars that show you when the moon set is. There eventually is, it turns out there's some days when the moon doesn't set. The moon sets already early the next day. And that's, we've been bidden to actually make our months, lunar months. It turns out that if you would take a full number of full lunar cycles, you could fit in 12 lunar cycles into any solar year, and it still wouldn't fit all the way. It's about 10 days or so difference, depends on the length of how exactly you define the solar year and how exactly you define the lunar months, but we have this 10-day lag, and every 3 years or so it makes a full month. Not exactly, they found that originally in the early Greek period, the exact calculation that the sages used, the almost exact calculation was after 19 years, you would have 19 times 12 lunar months, but you need to add another 7 lunar months to make it even out. And that's where we have our cycle. Every 7 out of 19 years, we add a month to the Hebrew calendar. In the time of the sages, they were probably aware of this ratio, but they made a year-by-year determination, sometimes even a few years in advance. But it was something that they announced around Rosh Hashanah time. They'd say, this is Rosh Hashanah has come upon us, and they would announce what day Rosh Hashanah was. That was the beginning of the Jewish year. And they'd also announced that they intended to make a second Adar. Adar is the last month of the Jewish calendar. It's the month number 12. It's always also the month right before Nisan, which has the important holiday of Passover when everybody has to show up in the temple. And the sages were already announcing that their intention was, based on their calculations, that this would be a good year to add a second Adar, although technically speaking, according to the halacha, they had until the start of Adar, whichever Adar that would be, to say, no, this is just going to be the first Adar. There's going to be a second Adar even after it. They had that ability, although that was not wise. And the Gemara and the Talmud and Maimonides have a number of other considerations that the sages used, perhaps when they should make a leap year and when not. They also talk about people who are disqualified for giving an opinion. For example, the king. The king was not supposed to have input in whether to decide to add a month to the year or not, because he would pay his soldiers an annual salary, and he would probably be biased toward adding a month. It means he would get a month of service without an additional pay. They also say the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, wasn't allowed to give his opinion. He was interested in not making a leap year so that Yom Kippur would fall out earlier in the solar season. If Yom Kippur is September 27th, that's a lot more comfortable than having Yom Kippur October 27th. It's much warmer. And the Yom Kippur and the Kohen Gadol had to immerse himself 5 times during the day of Yom Kippur in mikvot that weren't exactly heated to our current standards. So you can see he had a bias there. They talk about how the Shemitah year, for example, was a factor. Perhaps it wouldn't have been smart to make a Shemitah year also a leap year, because it's a little bit harder on people the Shemitah year when they can't work the fields and they have to scrounge for food. So to make that year extra long was not exactly the smartest thing. Or perhaps if it's not such a plentiful year, it's not a rainy year, and the people are waiting to be able to eat from the new crop of grain, whatever they got. Adding a second other was an inconvenience. Also, it means they would have to wait another month before they would bring the korban omer on the second day of Passover, which would permit the consumption of that year's new crops. So that was also something that they didn't necessarily want to do. Nowadays, we just have a cycle. The Shemitah year is declared to be every seventh year. We don't even add yovels anymore. And we already have determined that years 3, 6, 8, 11, 14, 17, and 19 of a 19-year cycle are going to be leap years. So you have this phenomenon of leap years during Shemitah years, and that's how it happens. 7 out of 19 and 1 out of every 7 are two prime numbers, basically, and two prime number cycles, such that they every year there's no pattern, there's no differentiation in here that would allow for certain types of leap years to either always be Shemitah years or not. It actually has an interesting pattern. You can see there. Wish I had the math know-how to explain this part, but if you would take any prime number cycle like that, a cycle of 19 and a cycle of 7, and just write them both out, you'll see that eventually, let's say the Shemitah year falls out in a perfectly equal distribution on any of those 19 years. Any of the 19 years of a cycle can be a Shemitah year or not, and over the course of 100 years, you'll see that it's actually an equally distributed, perfectly equally distributed, and that consideration is no longer taken because we don't have these deliberations. Join us for next time. We're going to continue talking about this topic. Don't forget to send your questions, comments, like and share, and don't forget to check out the Haggadah. And thank you very much for your support. We're almost there, and thank you.